Pokémon Red and Blue hit the shelves on September 28th of 1998. We in North America never got to see the release of the original Pokémon version that was released in Japan, which was called Pokémon Green. Today, we're going to make the first real on-console Pokémon game by taking an English-translated Game Boy version of Pokémon Green and turning it into a playable Super Nintendo cartridge. This is Steve from Restalgia, and let's get started. This is a project I've been wanting to make a video about for quite a while now, and with the new Pokémon movie coming out this past week, I figured now would be as good a time as any. I've been making these things for quite a few years now, and have been able to fine-tune the process. Additionally, there are now some parts you can purchase that make this whole process a lot easier. This mod can be used for any Game Boy game and some Game Boy Color games. For this video, we're going to be using an English-translated reproduction cart of Pokémon Green. Full disclosure, this is not a mod I would recommend to a beginner on the soldering iron. It takes a fair bit of patience and a fairly steady hand. But with that out of the way, let's get this thing started. Some things that we're going to need for this modification are the Super Game Boy. Now I'm going to be using a Super Famicom version, and that's just because they're a lot cheaper and there's a lot more of them available in the market, so it's easier to get a hold of. Don't worry, both the Super Famicom and the Super Nintendo versions are identical and are essentially the exact same board. We're going to need a Game Boy game, and in this case we're going to be using our Pokémon Green cartridge, a Nintendo security bit screwdriver, a Phillips screwdriver, and an electronic screwdriver kit. Some 28 gauge wire, or you could use one of these pre-made flex cables made by Retro Circuits. I'm going to be using the flex cable for this video because it's much more time efficient and reliable. Some soldering flux, a craft knife or an X-Acto knife, a pair of sharp precision side cutters, some solder. I'm going to be using super wick or soldering braid. You can try to use a solder sucker or a soldering vacuum if you have access to them. I find that the wick works well though. We need a colored Super Nintendo shell. These come in a wide variety of colors to pick from, but for obvious reasons we're going to go ahead and use the green one for this project. We need a rear label for our Super Nintendo shell. We also need our front cover label. And finally, we need a soldering iron. If you're new to soldering, be sure to tin the tip properly, otherwise you're going to have a hard time with it, and it will probably end up destroying the tip of your iron pretty quickly. So the first thing that we're going to go ahead and do here is grab our Super Game Boy and remove the 4 screws holding the shell together. Next, we need to remove the 2 Phillips head screws attaching the main board to the rear case. Now that we have the board out, you'll see that there's a black cartridge slot where your Game Boy games would normally slide in and connect to the main board. We're going to actually need to remove this from the board. You can see there are 32 pins on the back here that need to be desoldered. This process is slow and does require patience. The first thing that we're going to do is apply some flux to these pins. That's going to make it a lot easier for the old solder to melt and be removed. Next, we need to grab our soldering braid. Now I mentioned that I'm using the Super Wick brand, and it is important to use a good quality braid or you're going to have a harder time with the solder getting sucked into the braid. We are going to apply the braid directly to the pins that we're wanting to desolder, and then we're going to press our hot soldering iron down on the joint. You should be able to hear it melting and see the wick start to suck up the old solder. We're going to be doing this for all 32 pins. Remember that your wick will get really hot and that heat transfers right up the braid. The wick can also only hold so much solder, so be sure that you trim the wick as you go. Once we have removed as much solder as we can, we're going to grab a pair of strong tweezers and firmly but carefully rock each pin to make sure that it's loose. You will find some pins that are not fully desoldered, and that's totally okay. You can try to further remove the solder with your wick if needed again, but it's not the end of the world if you're having trouble with it. There is an alternative thing that we can do later. Next, we're going to begin rocking the plastic cartridge holder back and forth gently to help break any of the little solder joints that are still attached. Be very careful doing this. If you're too rough, you can damage the pads on the board itself, which will ruin the board and render it more or less useless. As you rock it, you'll be able to see which pins are not moving as much or at all, and you can add your soldering iron directly to those pins, which will melt the solder and help you loosen them. Eventually, you will feel the plastic piece rock free and you can carefully remove the part. Once the part is removed, you will want to run your solder wick over the surface of those pinholes to remove any leftover solder that's left. The board looks really dirty and burnt, but that's just the flux residue. We're going to go ahead and take care of that and clean that off right now. All that we need to do to clean it is to get a Q-tip and dip it in some rubbing alcohol. Now we're just going to go ahead and wipe the board with it, and as you can see, the board looks as good as new, and we can set it aside. Now we need to grab our Pokémon Green game. We'll need to remove the screw on the back to access the cartridge. One thing I'd like to mention is that if you're using an original Game Boy and not a reproduction game, it would be wise to replace the battery at this point, just so you don't have to worry about it after the shell and the final product is fully assembled. So now we have a couple of options on how we want to connect our two boards. One way is the way I used to do these for many years, which was to grab these pre-cut wires and connect them literally one by one, pin by pin, between each board. This took a really long time and left a ton of room for mistakes, which I have made multiple times. Now there is a really awesome flex cable made by Retro Circuits that makes the process much easier. It is made specifically for this application. It is designed in a way that allows you to line up the pin connectors and just add solder. For this video, this is the method we're going to go ahead with. What we need to do is align the flex cable pinouts to the pin locations on the Super Game Boy PCB. This is really easy to do because there's really only one way they can line up. Additionally, both the Super Game Boy and the flex cable have the pin numbers printed right on them, so you can always cross-reference that if you need it. We're using a bit of electrical tape to hold the flex cable in place until we've applied some solder. Once the solder is on, we can remove the tape to get access to the rest of the pins and finish applying the solder. Next, we need to attach the other end of the ribbon to the Pokémon game. Again, this is important that you connect the labeled pin location 1 to the first pin on the Game Boy game. The pin numbers on the Game Boy will be pin 1 on the far left of the cartridge, assuming it's facing you, all the way to pin 32 on the far right. I find the easiest way to attach this is to pre-apply a small amount of solder to each pin on the Game Boy game. You're going to want to apply just enough solder so that way when you heat it up, it has enough that you could stick something to it. If you apply too much, you run the risk of bridging a couple of the pins, and the game won't work properly. I recommend applying the solder and then using a solder wick to remove all the excess solder, leaving just a thin layer behind. Now we just need to line up our pins and place a bit of tape on it to hold it in place. We can apply the heat of the iron to one of our pins to get the flex cable to stick to the game. And then we can apply just a little bit of solder over top of the joint. Now we're just going to repeat this process for all the pins. If you have a multimeter, this can come in handy to help make sure none of your pins are bridging. Just set it to check for continuity and check the pins that are right next to each other all the way down. If you don't get a reading, then nothing is bridging and you're ready for the next step. We can now grab our empty green Super Nintendo cartridge, which we're going to have to modify just a little bit so that way we can fit our board into it. The Super Game Boy board has 3 sets of connectors coming out of the bottom. Most, if not all, reproduction shells are made for non-FX boards. Most games fit into that classifications, but games like Star Fox and Stunt Race FX use these chips. Because of this, we need to trim some of the plastic to allow for all the pins to come out. This is easy enough. All we need to do is line up our board on the cartridge shell and use our side cutters to mark how far out we need to trim. Then we can again use our side cutters to cut out those pieces. Try your best to make the cut as flush with the existing cutout as possible. If needed, you can always trim it up with a craft knife or your X-Acto knife. Next, there's a piece of plastic on the bottom right hand side of the shell preventing the board from sitting in there. So what we're going to need to do is go ahead and trim that out. Again, we can place our board in and trim around it. Finally, in the top right corner, we have just a tiny little bit of plastic to trim. We're going to go ahead and make our mark, and then we're going to remove the little bit of plastic. I find that my craft knife is best used for this part. We can now take our board and see how well it fits in the case. It should fit snugly and have little to no movement even when it's being shifted. We're going to go ahead and tuck our Game Boy game in behind our board. There should be plenty of room to do that. Once it is seated, we'll make sure that our board is also sitting nice and firmly in the shell. We're ready to reassemble our case. The top of the shell should slide on with absolutely no problems or modification. Once it's in place, we're going to screw the case back together with the screws provided with the shell. If you don't like the ones provided, you can always reuse a couple screws from the Super Game Boy case. They will fit. The case looks good and everything is fitting and neat inside. We can now apply our labels. We are going to first apply the rear reproduction label. The key to not getting any bubbles is to slowly apply pressure from one side to the next in a side sweeping motion. We're going to end up doing the same thing with the front label. This time, we're going to start from the top spine of the game and work our way down. And there it is, our completed game. Let's get this thing plugged into our Super Nintendo and test it out. Now some of you are probably thinking, why would you take a game where the only way to 100% finish it is to trade with a friend to get all 151 Pokemon? Well, part of the reason I've waited this long to post this video was because I previously made a video tutorial on how to add a link port or trading port to your Super Game Boy. If you're looking for the full functionality of the game, you could easily add that mod to this cart. I will leave it as a suggested video in the end credits if you haven't seen that yet. Be sure to check it out if you're interested. Now, as you can see, these do make really cool game mods. But as cool as it is, I felt like it was still incomplete. So, I had a custom game box made for it, but I didn't stop there. I ended up making one for each of the Game Boy versions that were compatible. You may notice I have almost all of them here. Actually, I do have them all here, except for Pokémon Crystal. Pokémon Crystal is exclusively a Pokémon Color game, and it's not compatible with the Super Game Boy. So if you're planning on doing this mod, and at this point I'm not quite sure anyone would want to, be sure to test the game on the Super Game Boy before starting. If it plays, it will work for this mod. And that's all I've got for this video. Be sure to share the video with your friends as it helps me and the channel a great deal. Subscribe for more content like this, turn on notifications, and give the video a thumbs up. Let me know your thoughts about this project in the comment section down below. Thanks for watching, and I'll talk to you guys again real soon.